Welcome to our tax podcast series. I am Vineet Desai and I have with me Anita Nair. Today we bring to you a topic which was much talked after the recent budget amendments. It's buyback tax and related amendments.
Thanks, Vineet. In fact, ever since this amendment has been announced, there have been several discussions about the impact on domestic companies which are held by domestic shareholders, individual promoters, and how the tax on them is all set to increase as compared to the present regime where companies pay 20% tax on buyback. But I think today what we would like to discuss or turn our focus to is another interesting aspect, which is on tax on cross-border buyback of shares. But I think before we delve into that discussion, can I request you to quickly take our listeners through a recap of how buyback taxation has evolved in India?
That's an interesting question, Anita. So it has been, I think, a long journey for the buyback related taxation. It started with capital gains treatment. Maybe until 2 decades earlier, it was capital gains. Thereafter, in 2013, the whole burden was shifted onto the company for certain categories of buybacks. That got then extended to all kinds of buybacks, including scheme, in 2016. In 2019, the scope was extended to include even listed companies. And now, after a decade, the regime has now shifted tax treatment back to the shareholders. So today what we are told is, if a company does a buyback post 1st October 24, it will be taxed as if it was a dividend, irrespective of accumulated profits of the company. There will be no deductions available, and whatever cost is attributable to those shares which are offered in buyback, that will be available as capital loss to be used in accordance with law. So that has been the journey over last two decades for this buyback.
Thanks, Vineet, for that summary. In fact, I would like to start the discussion actually by moving into the aspect of how would the treaty look at this income from buyback of shares. So I think the moot question in everyone's mind is, how would the treaty characterize this income? Would it look at it as dividend income or income from capital gains? And I think a good starting point for that could be the OECD Model Convention. And the reason I say that is because you know that a large number of India's tax treaties are modeled on OECD. So they borrow from or adapt the definition of dividend, which we find in the OECD Model Convention. So what our listeners can see on the screen is the definition of dividend as per Article 10 in the OECD Model Convention. So I think I want to stress on two aspects in this definition. As you're aware, the first limb, which says that dividend means income from shares. And the other limb, which says that dividend also could mean income from other corporate rights, which are subjected to the same tax treatment as income from shares in the country where the company making the distribution is a resident. But you're also aware that no one can deny that buyback is also a transfer of shares. And if it's a transfer, it's bound to fall under Article 13 for capital gains as well. So without getting very technical on this issue, I think what I'm trying to point out is there is an overlap. And how do we reconcile this overlap? The clue lies in the OECD commentary. So OECD commentary gives us this interlinkage between capital gains and dividend. What it simply says is that if transactions are like a reduction of capital, so for instance, our case of buyback of shares, and if the country in which the company making distribution is a resident looks on it as dividend or income from shares, it should go back to the dividend article. So I think one of the views that is possible is to look on this income from buyback of shares as dividend income or income from shares. Now, because we've already discussed the first limb, I won't really delve into the nuance of also can it be income from other corporate rights. But what I'd just like our listeners to look at is on the screen the table where we are trying to show them. These are the key jurisdictions that invest into India. This is the dividend rate. It could be 5, 10 or 15%. And how the definition compares with the OECD model. Some cases it's same, as you know.
Yeah.
Or some it could be different, better perhaps than the OECD model. But of course, just for completeness, there's one thing I must add. This is of course a treaty-based exercise, so each treaty has to be looked at separately. But a special mention of India, Mauritius and India, Singapore. I'm sure you've guessed why I'm referring to these two treaties. It's mainly because of the grandfathering benefit that's available here for investments made prior to 1st April 2017. Because for these investments, we are aware that there was a protocol introduced in 2016, and this grandfathering benefit is consciously a bilateral negotiation between India and either Mauritius or Singapore. And there's also a press release around the same time where they said they will not tax such income. So there are some views on whether this argument can be explored some more and whether the income could be capital gains. But I must mention this, Vineet, taking on from what you said in the introduction. One hand, we are saying that, look at the treaty benefit for dividend. Other hand, we are also saying capital loss is possible to claim under the Act. So in your experience, do you think this approach could create an issue?
That's an interesting question, Anita. I think the allegation could be that you are doing a cherry picking by having a treatment for dividend under the treaty, but capital loss under the domestic laws. But I'm sure there'll be strong defenses which we can build against that. We could evaluate that in more detail.
Thanks, Vineet, and it's good you made that point. I'm sure our listeners are taking note of that. But on that note, moving away from a very technical discussion to something more practical, after this amendment, in your experience, what's the general reaction that you're seeing about this amendment? I'm particularly speaking about buybacks in the pipeline. I'm sure what is being evaluated is what is the tax outcome if it's done before 1st of October, after 1st of October. So what are your thoughts on that?
So certainly, I think the day the announcements have come, after that there were maybe 2 to 3 months left for buyback new law to be effective, which is 1st October. And that window, people have started evaluating whether it makes sense to do the buyback before 1st October or after. And it's a question of financial modeling. As you can see on the screen, there are different scenarios possible, and in certain scenarios, the tax under the existing regime is lower, like scenario 2, and in certain other scenarios, tax under new regime is lower, like scenario 1. So it's a matter of evaluating the relevant facts in detail and then seeing which one works better. But of course, now since 1st October is almost there, the choice is no longer there, and we'll have to see on fact-specific cases what are the tax implications.
Right. So what I hear you say is a financial modeling exercise is what has to be carried out, and that's quite an interesting comparison to take note of.
Yes.
But Vineet, in the budget they often say that the devil lies in the detail. So what I'm going to ask you next is quite a nuanced question in terms of, if you closely read the amendment on deemed dividend, what it says is that income from buyback of shares shall be deemed to be dividend, provided that the buyback is in accordance with Section 68 of Companies Act 2013. Now you see they're using the expression in accordance with and not under Section 68. So just wanted, for the benefit of our listeners, do you think that change in expression impacts the scope of the amendment?
Yes, actually, I think if it would have read under Section 68, it would have probably narrowed down the scope to buybacks which have been done under that section only. And now since it is wider than that, probably the intention is to cover any other buybacks as well, which are not under that section but maybe under a scheme which is approved by NCLT. So that seems to be the intention there. But moving away from that point, now since we've discussed about cross-border buyback in a bit more detail, how does the arena of repatriation look like now post the buyback amendment?
Yeah, I'm happy to discuss that, Vineet, because you're right, we've discussed what happens in the transitional period, so now what next? Come 1st of October, I think if we first weigh out dividend simpliciter and buyback, I think what is noticeable is if we go by the view that buyback income is dividend under the treaty, the rates are comparable. So the rates will be the same. Of course, we must take a step back and say that non-tax consideration wise, dividend is simpler, plain dividend is faster as compared to buyback. But if we only compare tax outcomes, dividend you have the treaty rate, you have the same thing available for buyback under the view we just spoke of. Buyback additionally has the benefit of capital loss that you alluded to a while ago. And so that is the added advantage which buyback offers if there's an expectation that there will be gains in the future against which you can set off these losses. The other common modes of cross-border payments involving instruments, if I talk about redemption of preference shares, could be par or premium, capital reduction. As you yourself just mentioned, these are not buybacks in accordance with Section 68. So they are untouched by the amendment, so to say. But if someone wants to make a comparison between all of these, I think a financial modeling exercise would be called for to see buyback versus capital reduction and so on.
Yeah.
So I think we need, in this discussion, what we're probably trying to say is we covered the broad issues, but there are other nuanced points that remain to be discussed. Like for example, I could say, does transfer pricing apply? Can an income tax provision like 50CA be used to impute consideration?
Yeah.
Or, we just spoke about transitional period buybacks. What if a buyback scheme begins just before 1st October, concludes after October? What law would apply?
Yes.
Old law, new law, buyback versus capital reduction, so many more. So I think what we're trying to say here is we have tried to high level cover the issues, but there are several nuanced issues which need closer examination. I'm sure you'll agree, and I'll invite you to sum up our discussion for today.
Yes, Anita. So we started the discussion with how the amendments are impacting the domestic shareholders, and then we went into the nuances of how it's not only the domestic shareholders, but also there are lots of nuances as far as non-resident shareholders are concerned and cross-border buybacks are concerned. So I hope this was helpful and engaging for the listeners as well. Thank you so much, Anita, for sharing your guidance.
Thank you.